Hi, this is Igor Smirnov, and here is the video lesson called Another Fianchettoed Bishop. First, let me quickly tell you what we're gonna talk about here. Most players know the typical ways to attack an opponent's fianchettoed bishop on the king side and his castling position in general. We can exchange that bishop and try to use the weaknesses on the king side, or if you have a pawn onto the h-file, you can push it forward, disturb an opponent's kingside position in this way, and make use of the black's pawn onto g6. For example, this happens in dragon variation of Sicilian defense. In this variation, white usually realizes both of the ideas we were talking about. So white plays bishop h6, trying to use the weak squares around the black's king in the future, and also white pushes the h-pawn forward. These are very common ideas and everybody is familiar with them. In this lesson, however, I'd like to discuss another situation. We will analyze how to attack an opponent's fianchettoed bishop on the queen side. Yes, even if there is no opponent's king there, you still can organize an attack against that fianchettoed bishop. And now I'll show you some concrete ways to reach this goal. The first thing we need to understand is that the opponent's move b6 weakens a couple of light squares on the queen side. Therefore, it weakens the same color as the opponent's fianchettoed bishop. If you understand it well, then sometimes you'll be able to make use of that weaknesses. Now let's analyze one very interesting game about this topic. Knight f3, knight f6, the first moves are quite standard, and here black played b6. The move looks very standard, it happens often in similar positions, for example in Queen's Indian defense. Of course, black noticed that the white's bishop potentially can attack the rook on e8. At the same time, it's pretty obvious that white cannot capture the rook because black can easily close the diagonal. He can play knight c6 or maybe d5 and his rook will be protected. Perhaps black came to the same conclusion during the game and that's why he played b6. However, we need to think deeper. As we already know, the move b6 weakens a couple of squares on the queen side. Thus white can attack not only that rook onto the a8, but also all those weaknesses on the light squares as well. Black underestimated the value of this factor, and he had to pay for his mistake. White played knight e5, taking the rook. Now the answer d5 is forced, black has to close the diagonal. And white plays c4, increasing the pressure onto the black's pawn onto d5. In the game, black answered e6. He could play bishop b7 instead, but it doesn't matter. In any case, after knight c3, black replied bishop b7, so we would get the same position anyway. Now it looks like everything is fine with black. His d5 pawn is protected very well, and probably black is ready to go bishop d6, make castling, and everything is good for him. However, everything is not so simple. Right now, white can use another drawback of the black's bishop onto b7. When he places the bishop onto b7, it cannot be placed onto d7 anymore, and that's why it little bit weakens the diagonal a4, e8, and sometimes your opponent can use it. In this game, white really played queen a4, and this creates some troubles for black. By the way, this is very logical. White is organizing an attack on the weakened light squares. Okay, now the black's move knight b to d7 is forced. Now white took on to d5. In the game, black recaptured by the knight, which is probably a mistake, but nevertheless, even if he takes with a pawn, which was better probably, white can continue his attack and he can go, for instance, knight c6, using that weakness on the light square also. And if black plays queen c7 trying to capture that knight, white has a nice counter blow, knight takes d5. Now if black takes onto d5, white recaptures and protects his knight c6, therefore white is a pawn up at the end. if black tries to grab the c6 knight, then white will certainly take on f6 with check. This also attacks the queen onto c6, therefore black has to take. Then white goes bishop takes b7, and this is completely winning for white. White won the pawn already and will probably take the pawn on a7 as well, and so on. Okay, let's go back. In the game, black captured on the d5 with the knight. White also took. Now black can't take with the pawn anymore, because here white will play bishop h3, which is very unpleasant for black. Please pay attention to the fact that in all those variations, the light squares become crucial for black. Moving back to the game, black took with the bishop, bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen c6. Right now, white is finally using the weakness of those rook onto a8. White is going to take onto d7, and after queen takes, white will grab the rook on e8. That's why in the game black played rook c8, but now white can simply take the pawn onto d5, which gives him a material advantage without any compensation, and later on white won this game very easily. In this game, just one careless move b6 allowed white to organize a strong attack onto the light squares and to win the game easily. Now we will observe another similar example. In this position, black made an optimistic move d5, and also he underestimated the value of his weaknesses on the queen side. In fact, after the move d5, his position is already losing. White answered queen a4, and now if black makes the most natural move queen d6, protecting the knight, white can jump knight e5. Immediately or after an exchange onto d5, white can go knight e5, increasing the pressure on the knight and deflecting the queen. After a queen takes, into this following variation, white is obviously winning. In the game, black played another move, rook c8, which can't help either. White can play now queen takes a7, using the pin and taking the black's bishop onto b7. Black replied rook c7, now knight e5, e6, pawn takes, rook e1, preparing a discover check on the e-file, bishop e7, queen takes b6, and the black's position is completely destroyed. White already won 2 pawns and saves a strong attack. White won this game very soon. In this game we have seen a similar scenario with the previous example. The black's position on the queen side was weakened by his fianchettoed bishop, and only one careless move was enough to have a complete disaster. Now, the previous 2 examples were rather tactical. Of course, not always you can win the game so easily and win material just by using the opponent's weaknesses. But even if you can't, at least you'll be able to occupy the weak squares in opponent's camp and get a positional advantage. Now let's see how this can work. Let's say black has a fianchettoed bishop. Later on, black will probably move the pawn to d5 or to d6 in order to develop his queen and his rooks. Therefore, the position will look like this. Now we can see that if you can exchange an opponent's fianchettoed bishop, if you can eliminate this piece, after that you can easily occupy all those light squares on the queen side. And even if you cannot win a certain material right now, at least you will get much more active position and you will have a stable positional advantage. In this position, the black's queen side is also weakened by the move b6, and therefore white can use the weaknesses of the light squares there. For this purpose, white played bishop b5, taking the pawn onto c7, and after knight f6, white played bishop c6, which helps him to exchange the light squared bishops, and after that he can fix his rook on the c6 square and put pressure onto c-file. Yes, white is not winning right now, but this determines the white's huge and stable positional advantage. White can go knight e5, maybe fix his knight onto c6 later on. White can put pressure onto c-file, onto the black's backward pawn onto c7, and so on. In the previous example, we have seen that it's useful to exchange an opponent's fianchettoed bishop on the queen side. Now let's think how exactly you can do so. Most often you will create a battery with your bishop and queen, and it will look like this. After that you will play bishop a6 and will force that exchange. This is a very useful maneuver and it's useful to remember it. By the way, except using the weak squares onto the queen side, it has one more idea behind it. Now let's try to create a more practical position. This is still an imaginary position, but it is quite standard anyway. As we know, here white can play c takes d5 and then go bishop a6. Now we already know that after this exchange you'll be able to occupy the light squares onto the queen side and probably trying to place your piece onto c6 square. Also, there is another idea. Once those bishops are exchanged, you can after that attack the black's pawn onto d5, because right now it has only one defender, the f6 knight. You already traded the main defender of this pawn, which was the black's fianchettoed bishop onto b7. Also, black can try to support his d5 pawn by playing c6. Still, even after that, you can easily organize an attack onto that pawn onto c6. Once again, for lack of his light-scored bishop, you can attack that pawn very easily. Just double rooks onto c-file and the victory will be yours. There is a classical game about this topic, Bogolubov Capablanca, and right now let's observe it quickly. In this position, black played queen e7. This move has one obvious idea, it prepares the move e5. However, it also has one hidden idea. Black has a strategical threat, he is gonna exchange onto d4 and play bishop a3. We observed this maneuver just a minute ago. And if you combine both of these ideas with the move queen e7, you will definitely realize at least one of these ideas. That's why this is a very useful trick, and it's also useful to remember it. Okay, white played knight e5, preventing black from pushing e5, but now black realizes his second idea. He's taken onto d4 and plays bishop a3. After an exchange, we already can see that the white's pawn onto d4 becomes unprotected. White played knight a3, bishop d7. Right now the black's plan is very simple. He's going to double rooks onto c-file and put the pressure onto the white's pawns d4 and c2 or c3. White really played c3, then bishop b5, rook c7, rook f to c8, and okay, it's already quite clear that black has a superior position. Later on he played queen a5 and won the white's pawns. We will not look this game until the end. In this blog post below the video you will see the link for downloading of the complete games which we observed in this video, so you can take a look at it by yourself. And once again I strongly advise that you pay attention to the black's main idea, bishop d6 followed with bishop a3. Let's go back to the main position in this game. Yeah, this is that position where black played queen e7 and realized his maneuver bishop d6 to a3. At first sight it looks maybe not so good for black, because black has a good bishop onto d6, while the white's bishop on the b2 is pretty passive, and especially after an exchange onto d4 it looks like the white's bishop does nothing actually. Anyway, you are already familiar with the black's idea behind the move bishop a3. We do that because we want to exploit the white's weaknesses of the pawns and squares onto d4 and c3, and this can bring you a very easy win. That's why this maneuver bishop d6 to a3 is so powerful. So far we were analyzing how to attack an opponent's fianchettoed bishop on the queen side. Now let's think how you can play with the fianchettoed bishop and how can you repel an opponent's attack. Okay, so as we know, black will try to play bishop d6, queen e7, and bishop a3 after that. Okay, it will look like this. Also, black can push the a-pawn and try to disturb your queenside position in this way. Obviously, you have only one real idea to neutralize the black's both threats. You should push the a-pawn. You can push it to a4 or to a3. Which way is better? Well, there is no single correct answer because it depends on a concrete position, but still, I'd like to give you one recommendation about it. Now let's take a look at a concrete example. Okay, this is the position from the real game, where black played a5. Quite often black makes the move like that. He's going to play a4 and then maybe take on a3, maybe push a3 and disturb your bishop. In reply to such an advancement, white of course need to do the same and push his a-pawn. As we already analyzed, white can play a3 or a4. In this game, white preferred the a4 move, and now let's see what happened after that. Black played knight a6, and now he's going to bring his knight to b4, where it will stand quite well, and there will be no real way for white to neutralize that knight. Okay, let's make a few more moves. e4, knight to b4. Now, white cannot push away this knight with the a-pawn anymore, and white cannot really push the c-pawn because, well, first of all, it will weaken the d3 pawn, and secondly, it will close the line for his own bishop on to b2. And that's why, in fact, white has no way to somehow push away the black's knight from b4. At the same time, that knight is quite powerful. It attacks the white square c2, d3, it ties down the white's queen to defense of that pawn onto c2, and therefore it's pretty good for black. Also in the future, black can use the a4 pawn to open lines on the queen side. He can play c6, b5 and start an attack there. That's why I recommend that you play a3 instead. As you can see, with the white's pawn on the a3, it would be much easier for white. Well, of course, you need to evaluate the concrete position you have in your game, but very often when your opponent plays a5, you need to play a3 instead, and that will ensure that your position is safe. Now let's make up the main conclusions from this lesson. So the first conclusion: when an opponent has a fianchettoed bishop on the queen side, it weakens a couple of squares onto his queen side position. It weakens all the squares of the same color compared to his bishop. In other words, you can attack on the diagonals h1, a8 and on the diagonal a4, e8, and especially if the opponent's king is still in the center, you can deliver check from a4 or b5 squares, and this can be unpleasant for black. Now, when you're going to use that weaknesses, it's useful to exchange an opponent's bishop. For this purpose, you can create a battery contained from the bishop and queen and then go bishop a6. After that, you'll be able to place your piece onto the weakened square c6, or maybe other squares b5 and a6, and additionally, you'll be able to attack the black's pawns onto d5 and eventually his pawn onto c6. Now, this plan can be very powerful and can bring you an easy win. If you're playing black and you need to somehow prevent white from realizing this plan, you need to move the a-pawn. You can push it to a5 or a6, but it's more safe to push it to a6. In this case, you keep control over the squares b5, and even if white tries to push the a-pawn forward, like a4 and then a5, you'll be able to answer b5 and your position is still completely safe. As opposed to most of your opponents who focus their attention on the kingside position mainly, now you'll be able to attack his fianchettoed bishop on both wings. So I wish you good luck, thanks for watching and have a good day, goodbye.